Doing a virtual presentation also. If you can see it online. That's the garden is free.
My friends could buy one at the end. Oh, good. Thanks, Jim. This is good. This is good? How's that? Good. Good. Carry on. I was just testing.
This is Jim. That's my brother and sister. You met them before. Yeah, but there were all these mountains. LA's. That's a bamboo garden, and it was in bloom, and it's only 99 years or something. It's kind of weird. That's these little hanging green things. Let's see if I can find it. They have Asian gardens and a bridge.
Yeah.
It was just,
What? I thought we were.
I did too. I didn't know what was going on.
You know, this all over.
and I mean, flowers and chrysanthemums. It was this week that I was there a year ago.
Just a mess today.
Chrysanthemums. There, that's really It was a perfect day too.
My favorite part of London is
Yeah.
Have you been in the house yet?
Yeah.
Have you been in the house yet?
No. I was excited when we set this gig up until Emily said you were in the carriage house. What's up? But yes.
Never mind.
Sorry,
And I
Emily,
said-
I didn't mean to.
And I said it's too late.
Right. I'm sure they'll come back.
Yeah.
Look for the back. Look for the back.
The winter, so more events. Hand it over to Steve now. We will have a Q&A after the talk, followed by book signing. So enjoy.
Thanks, Emily. Mind if I do rearranging?
Oh yeah. Can I help you?
Thank you. Thanks, Emily, for a great intro. Emily's been great. This is my, just so you guys know, thank you. This is my things together, and some people do them well, and some people do them not so well. Emily's been great, staying on top of this and letting me know things and exchanging emails, and so it's very reassuring as an author when you do these events that something like that goes so smoothly. So thanks, Emily. Wanted to say thanks to you. Yeah, very much so. I've never been in the big house. When Emily told me when we set this gig up, I thought I was going to get in. Then she said, "You're in the carriage house. You're relegated to the carriage house." But I love this place too. We got a little tour where the horses used to be, and that was fantastic too. So I'm thrilled to be here. I've done so much speaking on this book. The response to the book has been terrific, I have to tell you. It came out in April, just so you know. And I have received more emails on this book than any of my other books in that period, in that 6-month period. It's just been from all over the country, so it's been really gratifying. We did a southern road trip earlier. I spoke in Montgomery, Alabama on this book, so that was kind of fun. It really went well. It was a good event down there. So it's been really the experience from writing this book and telling this Sumner story has been so interesting to me. It's the first full biography on Sumner in over 50 years. David Donald from Harvard did a first volume of a biography in 1960 and the second volume of the biography in 1970. Hasn't really been a full one since then. So exciting to tell a little bit more about Charles Sumner. He sits just a few hundred feet or 100 yards away from here in Harvard Square during the time when everybody knew who Sumner was, which is why it says Sumner. And he's also standing at the Public Garden on a pedestal. And on that pedestal, is chiseled the word Sumner, when everyone knew who he was. Not so many people know who he is today, which is why I'm glad for the book. At one of my presentations, I had somebody come up to me and say, "Listen, the only thing I know about Charles Sumner, the only thing I know is that the Sumner Tunnel is named after him." And I said, "Well, no, it isn't. It's not named after him, so therefore you know nothing about him, and you must read this book." And so that, I think, is one of the reasons why I feel like Sumner had to be risen from the ashes, because I think he has accomplished so much. When you look at Charles Sumner and you say, who is Charles Sumner, right? The technical, literal answer is he is the United States Republican senator from Massachusetts. From when he is elected in 1851 by the Massachusetts legislature, you'll recall we didn't directly elect senators at that point. 1851, he's elected until his death in 1874. He sits as the senator from Massachusetts, abolitionist, anti-slavery voice in the Senate. And when I say that he was a senator during the most polarizing, tempestuous, tumultuous 2 decades in American history, 1850s and 1860s, and that, of course, is what the run-up to the Civil War, the war itself, the assassination of Lincoln, and Reconstruction and all that entailed. So when I say it that way, it almost even seems kind of a tame period of time. But when I say Sumner was a senator and highly influential and highly involved in things like the Fugitive Slave Law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, his own Bleeding Sumner in 1856 when he's beaten to within an inch of his life on the Senate floor by a congressman from South Carolina. He is the founder, one of the founders, along with Lincoln, of the Republican Party. He's senator during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid and execution, right? He's senator when the South secedes, and after Lincoln is elected and the South secedes in the attack on Fort Sumter. He's the senator during the Emancipation Proclamation, the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address, all of the carnage in Virginia in 1864. He's the senator when Lincoln is assassinated. He's the senator during the Great Reconstruction period, and what I mean by great is it's massive, it's huge. And he's the senator that has a lot to do with the three great Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment that says blacks are citizens and establishes equal protection under the law and due process into the Constitution, and the 15th Amendment, which allows black men the right to vote. He's instrumental in all of that. And then just to top it off, in 1870, Charles Sumner is largely influential for seating Hiram Revels into the United States Senate. Hiram Revels, the first African-American member of Congress in United States history, is seated. He is the senator from Mississippi. And think about this. Hiram Revels takes the seat of the former Confederate States of America President Jefferson Davis. First black member of Congress takes Jefferson Davis's seat. Pretty ironic, pretty monumental. Sumner is at the center of so much of this during this time period. I call this book, actually, it's a biography, it's my first full biography, but I really call it a biographical history because he's involved during all of this. He is, without a doubt, the loudest, the clearest, the strongest, the most controversial, and the most unwavering anti-slavery, equal rights voice in America during this period. That voice does not belong to Lincoln. It does not belong to William Lloyd Garrison. It does not belong to Lydia Marie Child or Maria Weston Chapman or even to Frederick Douglass. The voice is Sumner's. He is the conscience of the North during this period of time. He does his very, very best to limit slavery when it was considered impossible, to end slavery when it was considered impossible, and to implement equal rights when it was considered impossible. He battled ferociously. He was unbribable, unbuyable, extraordinarily relentless, I would say. And I never once in all of my research came across a time when he compromised his principles for the sake of political expediency. All of that. It's why I call Charles Sumner one of the a small group, I put 5 in the group, but a small group of the most influential non-presidents in American history. So I put Sumner right there with Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Susan B. Anthony, and Martin Luther King Jr. I put Sumner right there. So, I mean, these people are more influential than many presidents, but certainly, you know, if you look at that group, they're in the top 5, I think, and there are others you could add, but Sumner is right there. That's how important he is. And he does this all, by the way. He is very condescending, very imperious, looks down his nose at people. He's a Harvard graduate. In fact, he's very, very close with Lincoln later in his life. And when Lincoln first, gets nominated, he's not sure Lincoln can do the job. Who is this hayseed from the Midwest? That was Sumner's initial reaction to Lincoln before they become very about that. The prologue, by the way, to this book is Sumner sitting at Lincoln's bedside the night Lincoln is shot. He spends all night, a vigil, all night until Lincoln is finally declared dead the next morning. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But Sumner does all of that with some of these personal flaws. He doesn't have a lot of friends. One of the friends he has, one of the lifelong friends he has, is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He's also very close to Fanny, thinks that she's a genius and is devastated when she dies. Such a horrible, horrible death. But when you look at him, most of his friends can only take him in very small doses. You know, we all have friends like that. Sumner was that guy, you know. Humorless, had a very difficult time relating to people on a personal level in I would say, a profession that requires alliances. He had a really tough time developing those alliances. So, you know, keep that in mind as we go through this. It costs him when he is caned. Hardly anyone comes to his rescue in the moment, for example. It costs him in a disastrous marriage that he has in 1866. Just has a really difficult time with people. But so when you look at him, and you know, when we do history, when we research history and we write history, you try to tell as much as you can about these, you know, real life monumental characters. You know, it's like an onion, you peel it away. And Sumner, in terms of his personal life, has struggles. In terms of his anti-slavery, equal rights life, is unparalleled, I would say. Unparalleled. And he does this anti-slavery, equal rights work really early. Really early. His first, I would say, foray into the equal rights efforts are even before he's elected. In 1849, he's a lawyer, you know, in Boston, lives in Boston, the backside of Beacon Hill. If you guys go there sometime, his house, there's a plaque in front of his house, sure. And he represents 5-year-old Sarah Roberts. Sarah Roberts, whose dad, a black girl, whose dad sued the Boston School Committee because Sarah was forced to walk by 5 white schools, all white schools, to get to an all-black school. Father sues the school committee rules against, you know, goes against Sarah, the Roberts, and so they appeal it to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, which was the process during the day. Come on in, guys. It's fine. Come on in. Take your time. Get to your seat and relax. Good. So they appeal it to the Mass Supreme Court. Sumner is the lead appeal lawyer in this case. He is appealing the case along with Robert Morris, who is only the second black attorney in the United States at the time. It's the first black-white team of lawyers that does this appeal. So he appeals it in front of the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, Lemuel Shaw, this kind of iconic jurist who's been there for 2 decades. You know, he rules with an iron fist. You know, strictly according to the law. Sumner goes in there and makes this extraordinary argument, and for the first time in American history uses the term equal protection under the law. It's used by Charles Sumner in 1849 in a Boston courtroom. And for the first time in history, in a courtroom, Sumner uses the phrase that separate but equal is inherently unequal. He uses that in 1849. 1849. He's 105 years ahead of his time. The language that he uses in this Sarah Roberts court case is almost identical to the language that Thurgood Marshall uses in 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education, where the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal is unequal. Extraordinary. Much of Sumner's language finds its way into Martin Luther King's arguments. Much of Sumner's language finds its way into the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's very, very much ahead of his time. Very, very early. Even really before 1849, even really before the abolitionist movement gets its full militancy under it, which doesn't happen until the 1850s. So Sumner becomes kind of a national name with this argument. He loses the case. The Supreme Court rules against Sarah Roberts and says the school committee is perfectly within its rights to say to the school. But Massachusetts itself integrates its schools in 1855, and it's Sumner's argument 6 years earlier that has a large influence in that. And so it's really such an important thing. He's elected, finally, in 1851, 2 years after. And he's elected as a direct result of the fugitive slave law and the way it is implemented here in Boston. Fugitive slave law, part of the Compromise of 1850. By the way, I'm going to talk to you about some things here that in high school history you said, why do I need to know this? Why do I need to know this? So you're going to have to think about this, and I'm going to refresh your memory a little bit. Compromise of 1850. How does it come about? It comes about when gold is discovered in California. You're allowed to say, huh? Say it. Huh? How does that happen? Gold is discovered in California. Thousands of people make their way west as part of the California gold rush. California becomes populated so quickly that it almost skips the territory stage and wants to apply for statehood almost immediately, within months. They apply for statehood to Congress. They apply as a free state. Only one problem. At the time in the United States, there are 30 states. 15 of them are free. 15 of them are slave. South's not happy about this. South says, number one, you're going to literally disrupt the power structure in Congress by adding 2 senators, 2 free state senators, number one. And number two, sort of in a symbolic way, you're going to disrupt the momentum of slavery for new territories that might get added and new states that might get added, which, by the way, I think is correct. The South is correct there. And so they demand something in return. They demand something in return. And Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and Henry Clay of Kentucky give it to them. And it's the Compromise of 1850, which includes an extremely strict, stringent fugitive slave law. Fugitive slave law basically says this, that a runaway slave who escapes to a northern state, on his way probably perhaps to Canada, but maybe just to a northern state, that the northern state, its legal apparatus, its police apparatus, its courts, all of it, are required to send that slave back to slavery, or required to assist a slave hunter that comes hunting for that slave, which was almost always the case, particularly with male slaves between the ages of 18 and 25, the most valuable slaves that plantation owners had. That was the requirement. In 1851, Boston sends its first slave back to slavery under the Fugitive Slave Law. It sends back Thomas Sims of Georgia. Thomas Sims was in Savannah, owned by a plantation owner in Savannah, stows away on a ship, gets taken to Boston, spends a little bit of time in South Boston, but eventually kind of becomes public, goes into downtown Boston. Slave hunter comes looking, sees him. The Boston police help the slave hunter as required by the Fugitive Slave Law. He is imprisoned quickly, and within a week is sent back to slavery. Sent back. The Boston Abolitionist community is outraged by this. Charles Sumner is outraged by it. Sumner had some issues with the abolitionist community, even though he was probably the biggest abolitionist of all. But he has problems that the abolitionist community is not militant enough, that they give great speeches. He had problems with William Lloyd Garrison. He thought Garrison was more of a show horse than a workhorse, a show pony than a workhorse, right? That he made a lot of speeches, that he wrote these great editorials, but that he didn't do anything in terms of action. And indeed, when Thomas Sims is being marched down to the docks at 4 a.m. in April of 1851, there's about 200 abolitionists around, but they are basically following this phalanx of soldiers and police. Sims is in the middle of this hollow square, as they call it, and don't do much besides jeer and hiss as Sims is being taken back and put on a ship back to Georgia. The abolitionist community gets even more outraged a week later when they find out that Sims was given 39 lashes on his bare back, which was the penalty for running away. And so the abolitionist community, with this fugitive slave law, Boston sends its first slave back to bondage, the cradle of liberty. Unbelievable. It comes as a shock to the abolitionist community, and the abolitionist community does become more militant. And that kind of influences other abolitionist communities around the North. But as a result of that, Charles Sumner is elected to the Senate. Now, he is not a favorite here. He is considered a very radical abolitionist in 1851. A lot of the moderates in Boston don't want him. A lot of the more conservatives in Boston don't really want him. But nobody emerges in this legislative battle for the Senate. So on the 26th ballot in the Massachusetts legislature, Sumner emerges and gets that vote. He gets those votes almost as a direct result of the Thomas Sims case. So that's how he goes to Washington. And when he goes down there, he delivers, think about this, the first anti-slavery speech in American history on the floors of Congress in 1852. Keep in mind, the kind of fragile balance between North and South over the issue of slavery had been kind of maintained since the Constitution was approved, but certainly since the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Who would like to sum up the Missouri Compromise of 1820? I will do it, thank you. No, pressure's off. Compromise of 1820, one of those weird compromises that Congress makes, right? The Compromise of 1820 said this, that every single state in the Union below the very famous 3630 parallel, remember that? 3630 parallel, slavery would be permitted. Every state north of 3630, slavery would be prohibited, except in one state, Missouri, which is north of the 3630, but slavery would be allowed there. And just to make it fair, just to balance it off, we'll take a big chunk of the state of Massachusetts and create a brand new free state, Maine. That's the compromise. It's a very odd compromise. There's more details to it, but that's the important point. So for the 30 previous years, that's how slavery had been managed. Sumner goes to Congress and in 1852 delivers a brilliant speech, 4 hours, which I will not recite now. 4-hour speech called his Freedom National Slavery Sectional Speech. And in this speech, he argues very persuasively, and I think correctly, that the foundation of the United States, the documents of the United States, the founding documents of the United States, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution particularly, are based in freedom and equality. That the South's argument that because slavery is not specifically prohibited in the Constitution, and therefore it should be allowed, was a backwards argument. That it was very clear when you look at the Founding Fathers and their intent, and when you look at the documents themselves, and when you look at things like the Northwest Ordinance from 1787, that did not allow slavery in the Western Territories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was very clear to Sumner that the fact that slavery wasn't mentioned in the Constitution didn't mean that it should be allowed, but meant that it should be prohibited. As Sumner said, the Constitution contains no language that allows Congress to create a king, and it contains no language that allows Congress to create a slave. It just doesn't exist. On some kind of a federal level, it doesn't exist. You cannot infer slavery, surmise slavery, suppose slavery, say through conjecture that it's not there. You can't do that. That's a false argument. That the Constitution, you should not discard the Constitution or shred the Constitution because it doesn't specifically prohibit slavery. You need to embrace it because it's indisputable language of freedom in both the Declaration and the Constitution obliterates the very notion of slavery. That's the argument he makes in 1852. It's quite early to be making this argument. He almost doesn't get the floor. They want to prevent him from speaking because there's a presidential election here, and there's a gentleman's agreement in Congress that the issue of slavery should not be discussed. We don't want to bring up any controversy. So he gets the floor, and he gets the floor arguing against the federal fugitive slave law. So if Congress has no power to create a slave, it certainly has no power to force free slave states to reach into free states and take people back to bondage. There is nothing that allows that. At the end of this speech, he moves to abolish the fugitive slave law. Now he loses 47-4 in the Senate. 47-4. Humiliating vote. He's even taken aback. I don't think he expected to win the vote, but I don't think he expected it would be that lopsided. But that's when Charles Sumner, that Freedom National speech, is when Charles Sumner becomes the new conscience of the North, the voice of the North, the anti-slavery voice of the North. Southerners even said, a new voice has emerged we can't compromise with on this issue. He's the one they feared the most. So Sumner continues this in 1854 when the Kansas-Nebraska Act occurs. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, another one of those ones that you have way deep in the recesses of your memory, but very, very important for this story and very, very important in American history. Kansas and Nebraska, both above the 36th parallel. They're territories they petition for statehood. And so another Northern Democrat, Stephen Douglas of Illinois, looks at this and says, both of these are above the 3630 parallel, but I'm going to propose that we completely obliterate the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And I'm going to put forth something else. That the people in these territories should be allowed to vote on whether they want slavery or not. I'm going to call it popular sovereignty. The North is outraged at this, howling with outrage. Stephen Douglas completely miscalculates the reaction in the North. The South is okay with it. They like it because they're figuring, we can move people from Missouri into Kansas and Nebraska. Wait a minute, Nebraska is a little too far north for slavery to be economically viable. In Kansas, it can, though. Not cotton, but things like rice, hemp, certainly. So we can move people from Missouri, slave state from 1820, into Kansas. And we can move people from the South into Kansas very easily if we do that. The North is outraged, and many, many, many Northern abolitionists make their way to Kansas, too. Stephen Douglas, by the way, is vilified in the North here. He's a Northern Democrat, and he's vilified by the North. They're furious with him. Huge rallies calling for him to step down and resign. He's a very self-aware guy, though, Stephen Douglas. Douglas commented that he could find his way home at night from Washington, D.C. to his home state of Illinois by the light of his own burning effigies in the North. That's a very self-aware statement. You don't hear those kind of statements. So totally miscalculates. Now, why would Stephen Douglas do this? Why would he put forth this legislation? I'm going to surprise you here. He does it for political reasons. Two reasons, really, two main reasons. Number one, Stephen Douglas has his eyes on the presidency. He's very ambitious. Has his eye on the presidency. Thinks he's going to need Southern Democrat support to get there. And he does. By the way, he's right about that. Politically, he will. That's one thing. Two, there's talk at this point, now it's 10 or 12 years early from when it actually happens, but there's talk at this point of a transcontinental railroad. The South wants the so-called eastern terminus of that transcontinental railroad to be located in the slave state of Missouri, that is St. Louis. Stephen Douglas wants the eastern terminus of that railroad to be located in his home state of Illinois, that is Chicago. And so he needs to throw a little bit of a bone to the South. What emerges is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What emerges is chaos. What emerges is mayhem, rape, murder, destruction in Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, that expression, bleeding Kansas, comes during 1855 with all the violence as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces fight it out in Kansas. Charles Sumner gets hundreds of letters from Kansans. Please, sir, help us. What are you doing about this? What can you do about this? It's a terrible winter out here in 1855. Winds are howling, snow is out here, and people are dying. Printing presses are getting thrown into rivers. You know, there's murder. All of that is going on out here because of the violence in Kansas. And so Charles Sumner does what he does best. He's an orator. He's a great orator. And finally gets the floor in May of 1856, because he's going to deliver another really extraordinary speech called The Crime Against Kansas. 5 hours long, 3 hours on May 19th, 2 hours on May 20th. The place is packed. New York Times reporter said even the ladies' gallery was filled to overflowing. Sumner had this reputation as a great orator, and he packed the house when he spoke. And he delivers a really great speech on all the violence in Kansas and how bad slavery is. You know, look at what it's produced, et cetera, et cetera. But he also does something else. Brooks thinks and ponders, and on the morning of May 22nd, as we approach noontime, the Senate is out of session. The House is out of session. They both recessed because of a funeral of one of the members. And so Charles Sumner is in the chamber. He's sitting at the front of the chamber at his desk. Sumner's a big guy, 6'4", huge legs. His legs are kind of tucked under the desk. He's on a chair with wheels on the bottom, as they say, desk manacled to the floor. His head's down. He's signing copies of the Crime Against Kansas speech, franking copies to send to his constituents, to send to the press around the country, et cetera, et cetera. Preston Brooks walks in. He has a cane. Now, he uses a cane. He was wounded in a duel himself in 1840 in the hip. He uses a cane every once in a while. walks in with a cane and two of his colleagues, intent on doing something almost immediately, but, as he says later, saw a lady talking to the sergeant of arms, and he felt what he came to do would not be a chivalrous thing to do in front of a lady. She leaves after about 10 minutes, talks to the sergeant of arms for about 10 minutes, leaves. Preston Brooks stands up, walks down the center aisle with his cane. Sumner still has his head down, furiously signing, oblivious to Preston Brooks's presence. Walks down the center aisle, gets to Sumner. Brooks raises his cane and says, "Mr. Sumner." Sumner raises his head at that point, and Brooks says, quote, "I have read your speech over twice. It is a libel to my state and my kin." And slam, brings the cane down on the top of Charles Sumner's head. Sumner's head explodes in blood. And the blood loss really, I think, sends Preston Brooks over the edge. And Brooks proceeds to beat Sumner again and again and again with his cane. Sumner's trying to get out from his legs from out under the desk, can't do it. Literally wrenches the manacled desk from the floor as he's trying to get away. And Brooks grabs him by the lapel, won't let him do it, and beats him again and again. Shatters his cane in the process until it's all the way down to the golden knob, covered in blood. He says later, "I gave Sumner 30 first-rate stripes. Every one of them went exactly where I intended, and by the end, he was bellowing like a calf." He beats him into unconsciousness, and just before he loses consciousness, Charles Sumner says, "I can't believe such a thing was possible." News of the caning goes through the country like wildfire. There's 3,000 newspapers in the United States at the time. Everyone who could read reads one. Already have a telegraph. It's been around for 12 years. And so it spreads quickly. It's on the front page of every newspaper across the country. Two very different responses. The North outraged. Even people who aren't big Sumner fans. The more moderates. A moderate in Michigan who says to himself, maybe slavery's not the greatest thing, but it doesn't really affect me. Maybe I don't want it extended, but it doesn't affect me on a day-to-day basis. I don't have a strong feeling about it. Those folks are outraged. And they are left politically with almost no place to go but to the abolitionist side, to Sumner's side. In the South, a very different reaction. Preston Brooks is lauded in the South. The South celebrates the attack on Sumner, this uppity abolitionist. Finally got what he was coming to him. Many Southerners sent Preston Brooks canes as gifts, many of them inscribed with the words, "Hit him again." Editorials across the South, not totally universal, but almost, praised Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks, between the caning in May of 1856 and his sudden death in January of 1857 from a throat infection, those 8 months, is as big in the South as John C. Kelly was before him and Robert E. Lee was after him. For that window, he doesn't have the staying power of either of those two. But for that window of time, he's as big in the South. Sumner is seriously injured. Head, scalp, brain trauma, spinal injuries, neck injuries. And he's out of the Senate for 3 years, a little over 3 years. He tries to get back a couple of times. Can't do it. Has PTSD, as we would call it today, no question. Every time he gets close to Washington, the headaches get intense. They're terrible. Goes to Europe twice during this to try to get his health back, regain his health, restore his health. A French surgeon decides that one way to alleviate the pain is to undergo this excruciating treatment called the fire treatment, where he would burn Sumner up and down Sumner's bare back with an open flame as a way to alleviate the pressure on his spine. Sumner was burned 8 times in 1858. Terrible. Writes in his letters how serious pain he's in. He can barely walk. He's got suppurations. He's got boils on his back. He can't lay on his back. He can't move terrible for that time. The caning is a huge deal politically. John Brown gets word of it 2 days later in Kansas and goes on a murderous rampage where he and his family brutally murder a couple of pro-slavery families. Cut off their arms, their legs. It's awful. It's very graphic. Almost as a direct result of the caning. But the other thing that happens in the caning is that the Republican Party, this fledgling Republican Party that had just been formed 18 months ago, at the earliest in some states, even more recently in others, the Republican Party uses the caning as a way to recruit new members, particularly during the summer and fall of 1856. Charles Sumner, who's trying to get back during that time, so the letters are kind of sad, because he writes to his Republican colleagues to say, I yearn to be back in the Senate, I yearn for my voice to be heard, and most of the responses he gets kind of go something like this: you know what, don't rush. Take your time. Make sure you're fully healthy. Or as one person said, keep in mind, your vacant chair speaks even more effectively than you can. So they're using this as a symbol. This new anti-slavery Republican Party recruits so many members between the summer and fall of 1856 that they run their first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, in 1856, and he almost wins. He loses to James Buchanan. But that's only because he lost a few northern states to Buchanan. The South sees very clearly in 1856, if somebody runs and a united North votes for him, that is, every state in the North, a president can be elected without a single Southern electoral vote. Which is, of course, what happens, by the way, in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln is elected. But the harbinger of that is in 1856, and is almost a direct result of the caning. Sumner finally comes back fully restored, as he says, although I would say he never is totally fully restored. You know, he has injuries, it's kind of like aches and pains in his back and his neck happen throughout his entire life. But he comes back, and in 1860, June of 1860, delivers another incredible speech called The Barbarism of Slavery. Now, leading up to that, there was all this chatter in the Capitol, all this chatter in the Senate. Is he going to be the same tough guy? Is he going to be as tough as always? Will he have mellowed? No, he does not. He delivers that speech, and it's a brilliant speech about the evils of slavery in its entirety. Never mind South, never mind the fugitive slave law, just in general. And it is the last anti-slavery speech in American history. He delivers the first in 1852 and the last in 1860. There are no big speeches in the summer and the fall. Lincoln is elected in November. The South secedes. South Carolina goes out in December of 1860. The rest of the South secedes later, and Fort Sumter is in April of 61. So it's the last major anti-slavery speech. I want to just fill in a little bit of a palette on the Sumner-Lincoln relationship. Pretty interesting. They only know each other for 4 years. Sumner doesn't actually meet Lincoln until Lincoln comes east for the inauguration. In the inauguration in March of 1861 at the time. And of course, Lincoln's assassinated in April of 65. It's a 4-year relationship. But the two men grow very, very close. And the two men learn from each other. Sumner is Lincoln's moral conscience from the beginning. From the beginning, Sumner wants Lincoln to make the war about not just preserving the Union, not just reuniting the Union, reestablishing the Union, but to make it an anti-slavery war as well. That the Union, in order to be fully restored, needs to get rid of slavery. Lincoln resists this at least until, I would say, the fall of 1861. Right around there, just around Christmas, a little before Christmas of 1861, Lincoln starts to evolve. Sumner is relentless in trying to get Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Relentless. During the summer of 1862, Sumner's like, why haven't you done this? Lincoln says, we need to win something first. We're getting killed. The South is killing us. What effect does the Emancipation Proclamation have? I need a win. On September 17, 1862, the Battle of the Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, he ekes out the win. It's a draw, essentially, but the Union ekes out a win. And Abraham Lincoln, on September 22nd, issues the Emancipation Proclamation that he says will take place on January 1, 1863. But we needed that win to have, for the Emancipation Proclamation to have any teeth at all. They learn from each other. Lincoln learns moral courage from Charles Sumner, the importance of standing tall, even if it's not always politically the exact right thing to do. But Charles Sumner learns from Abraham Lincoln, too. What does Charles Sumner learn from Abraham Lincoln? First thing, the use of humor and the effectiveness of humor in tense situations, in political situations. Sumner was basically humorless. One of his friends in college said, if you told Charles Sumner that the moon was made of green cheese, he would spend the next 3 hours telling you scientifically why that could not be the case. Just didn't understand it. So the first time Lincoln and Sumner meet, think about this, is in March of 1861. Lincoln's the president-elect. He's receiving people at the hotel. Sumner comes in. Lincoln looks at Sumner, holy cow, here's a guy who's 6'4", like me. You hardly ever see that. So Lincoln says to Sumner, let's stand back to back to see who's taller. Sumner doesn't know what to do with this. He's completely flummoxed by it. And he mutters something like, oh, sir, rather than uniting our backs, let us unite our front against the slave power. Words to that effect. Sumner leaves. Lincoln says, I've never met a bishop. That man reminds me of a bishop. He's he's way too uppity, and but Sumner over time softens a little bit. Never becomes like a stand-up comedian, but softens a little with under Lincoln's tutelage. Like he kind of sees the effectiveness that this Midwesterner, this backwoodsman, this log cabin guy has, using some humor. So that's one. Two, Lincoln teaches Sumner, sometimes politics is necessary. Best example, the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, if you remember high school history, applied only to the states in rebellion against the United States. That is, the southern states that seceded. But there's 4 border states in the north, part of the Union, in which slavery is very, very much alive and prevalent. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri is back. All northern states, northern border states, all allow slavery. Sumner says to Lincoln, I think that Emancipation Proclamation needs to include the border state slaves too. Lincoln says, I can't do that. Sumner says, why? Remember, it's 1862, it's early. Why? And Lincoln says the following, I hope I have God on my side in this struggle, but I must have Kentucky. I must have Kentucky. Kentucky has farmland. Kentucky has factories. Kentucky is the sentinel state that protects Indiana and Illinois. If I include these 4 border states in the Emancipation Proclamation, they almost certainly will secede. If I lose Kentucky, I will lose Maryland. If I lose Maryland, kiss D.C. goodbye. Right next door. Sumner's like, oh, I kind of get that. In his own way, I kind of get that. I see what you're saying. So Lincoln does this repeatedly with Sumner to say, listen, politics is part of this when you make these decisions. And I think the third thing Lincoln teaches Sumner is just this power of personal connection. Best example, and this is in the book, best example, April of 1865, Sumner and Lincoln and a few others are at Grant's headquarters in City Point, Virginia, which is, you should go there if you haven't had a chance to go there. It's quite a place. City Point, Virginia, Grant's headquarters, is also a large Union hospital. Wounded soldiers, terribly wounded soldiers. You know, soldiers who are missing arms, like the awful, wounds of the Civil War, which I'm sure you guys know. Sumner says he was in awe watching Abraham Lincoln shake 5,000 hands at this Union hospital and seemed to know exactly what to say to each man, exactly how long to stay at each bedside and when to move on, exactly how to be inspirational without being patronizing with these guys who were at their absolute worst physically. And Sumner admired it. Sumner said, I don't have that skill, but how valuable is that skill? So the two have this really interesting relationship, very close. They become very close. And as I said, Sumner, when you read the prologue of this book, Sumner, as Lincoln is about to die, says, I sobbed like a woman. He really respected Lincoln. So that relationship between Sumner and Lincoln is a big part of this story. I'll close with this and then get to your questions. So Charles Sumner, what do we owe Charles Sumner? Reconstruction kind of goes awry with the Compromise of 1877, leads to the rise of the Jim Crow laws and the Klan and all of that, so it takes some time. As I say, almost 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education. If you want to use 1947, when Jackie Robinson breaks the color line, 1948, when the United States desegregates the military, et cetera, all the way up to the Civil Rights Movement. Sumner's kind of contributions, I think, get a little bit delayed through no fault of his own, just through kind of historical serendipity. But I think we owe Sumner, because he believes so much in the country. He believed in it when he was trying to abolish slavery. He believed in it when he was beaten to within an inch of his life. He believed in it during Reconstruction, when Reconstruction was going bad, during the war. And I think we owe him for his ideas, for his ideals, for his courage, for his relentlessness, and I think for his vision. He actually believed that an America without slavery, had the promise that could change the world, had a promise that could change the world. He believed that. So I think we owe him for that vision and owe him for his action, that he would fight so hard for a more perfect union in this country that he believed in so deeply. So thank you so much. And please, I ask for your questions after I get a drink of water. Thank you. When we do questions, you should feel free.
And I had trouble figuring out what this scandal was.
I can't wait for you to read the book.
Okay.
It's gonna be awesome. Awesome. I won't get into all of the research. That's in there and all the stuff that's in the book. But the answer to your question is yes. That's in there and all the stuff that's in the book. But the answer to your question is yes. I do delve into his. He has a very difficult family life. Gets along with almost none of his 8 siblings except for one, Mary, who dies very young, while Sumner's recovering from his own illness in the same room, the next bed. Becomes kind of close to Mary. Other than that, has no real relationship with his siblings, including he's a twin. does not have that inexplicable bond that twins have. He's not very, his dad is really tough taskmaster, does not have a good relationship with his dad. His dad, when his father dies, Sumner's in Europe, does not come back for the funeral, and says, I really don't have a good reason to come back. And his friend, one of his friends says, I know the situation at home, and I totally understand. Sumner's one of these guys who doesn't have a lot of lifelong friends. Like I said, Longfellow is the exception to that. He's a friend of Sumner all the time. And Sumner was really liked Fanny a lot. But on the other hand, Sumner, again, doesn't have that really good kind of people sense. So, because Henry, you and I have these great conversations all night, these great political debates, these great debates about artwork and poetry, and what's going to become of me. And then eventually he accompanies. She steps out on him, and there are other things that are kind of part of that. That's what they're referring to during the funeral. Yeah. Yeah, of course. What else? Yeah.
I grew up in Missouri, and so the Dred Scott case was incredibly focused on when we discussed the Civil War. And I wondered whether Sumner had any input or anything to do with it or any reaction to it, because it was seen as a terrible decision within the St. Louis part of Missouri.
Yes, so the Dred Scott decision, just like a quick recap, right, is the decision that basically says that blacks are not citizens and thus can't sue, especially when they're taken, a slave's taken into a free territory, etc. It's delivered by Roger Taney, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at that time. It's a very confusing decision. Sumner is at that time leaving for Europe after the caning. That's one of his trips to Europe. I think it's the same day or the day after the decision comes down. He's leaving for Europe. So he's not directly involved in it. He's outraged by it, of course. And in fact, later on, when he's back, the Congress is debating whether to put a bust of Roger Taney in the Capitol building. Sumner's completely opposed to it because of that Dred Scott decision. Yeah, so, excellent. Did you guys hear her question? Sorry, I didn't repeat it. She's from Missouri. Yes. Yes.
I'm a fan of Longfellow, and this makes him an astounding man to be a friend to Charles Sumner. All of his idiosyncrasies and whatever.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, after Fanny burns to death, you can't put it any other way, right? After Fanny burns to death, Sumner's devastated, and the first thing he does, he leaves Washington, comes back. First thing he does is come to Henry. So there's that one place. There's these few places where Sumner is, kind of does get that human connection and the importance of that. But no, I think you're right. I think Sumner finds Henry, I would say, stimulating, and vice versa. Plus, the other thing Sumner does, very uncharacteristic. He's very, I'll say, playful with Henry's kids, his children. Horses around with them, tosses them up in the air. So Henry comments on that sometimes that, Charles is coming over and, the kids love to see him. So that's part of that too. But that relationship.
Did he give his money to the Longfellow family?
What's that?
Didn't he give his money, his inheritance?
Yeah, he gave his inheritance to the family. Well, he does two things. I think he does the inheritance to the Longfellow family, and he also does it to some arts project that escapes me now. Some arts that he does. So but yes, he does give a piece of it to the Longfellows. You are correct. Yeah.
So we have our online folks back.
Oh, sure, of course. Yes, of course. Yeah.
So the question online is, could you say something about Sumner's relationship with fellow anti-slavery Senator John Q. Hale of New Hampshire?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say his relationship is a good one. It's not overly close. They're not. I wouldn't call Hale and Sumner friends. They often will call each other, "Oh, my friend," like in that sense. Hale, if I had to describe Hale, this is no offense to Hale. Hale is like a Sumner light. Like maybe I would use that. He's an anti-slavery person. He does not have Sumner's passion. Does not have Sumner's oratorical skills. But he is a supporter of the anti-slavery cause. No question about it. That's what I would say. There's some mention of Hale. I wouldn't say it's an overly close, relationship. Does that answer your question? Yes. Yes.
So Charles Sumner was so ahead of his time with so many arguments about equal protection under the law.
I'm wondering if there's anything in the historic record about his views on women in civil society, in political participation, universal suffrage.
Yeah, great. That's great. Did you guys all hear that? So, yeah, good. So it's interesting. I would say Sumner there's a yin and a yang to here, right, with Sumner. He's has many women, I would say many, some women friends. Fanny is one of them. Some of the suffragists are friends. Harriet Beecher Stowe is a friend. He writes her this great congratulatory letter when she publishes on Tom's Cabin, for example, like that. So yes, he does have, I would say he has good relationships with women. But on the other hand, sometimes he's criticized because during the 15th Amendment debate, which is the debate that gives black men the right to vote, the suffragists wanted women to be included in the 15th Amendment. Neither Sumner nor any other abolitionist really fights for this. Sumner says, and so do other abolitionists, listen, this is a bridge too far right now. We have to get what we can get. And so that's going to be that. And that is what splits the suffragist movement. So one part of the suffragist movement kind of continues to be loyal to the abolitionist movement. They were very loyal to the abolitionist movement and very helpful. The other says, no way, we've waited too long. Don't tell us to keep waiting because it's a bridge too far. That splits the movement. And of course, I would say sets back the movement literally for 50 years, till 1920, with the 19th Amendment, right? So Sumner does not, I'm asked often, does he do a lot in the 15th Amendment discussion? And I would say no, he fights for other things in the 15th Amendment. In fact, he doesn't think it goes far enough. He fights for other equal rights things, for blacks to sit on juries, for example. He wants that in the amendment. All that gets stripped out. If you read the 15th Amendment, you can go home and read it tonight. You can read it during a commercial on TV. It's a very short amendment that basically says there can be no discrimination on the basis of race, period. And so, so it's a little complicated. Does that help? Yeah, great, thanks. What else we got?
Sumner grew up on May Street, on the other side of Beacon Hill.
Backside of Beacon Hill.
And all his neighbors were free blacks.
Yep.
And obviously he was bonding professionally with Robert Morris. Mm-hmm. So do you know much about his early years living on May Street? It's ironic too, people who were enslaved in this house, they must have seen, because they lived on May Street too, W. Vassell and the Cyrus, his brother. And they would have been much older, but it's ironic, he would have seen them on May Street. Up.
Well, all I can say is, you're right, he lives very close to a pretty large African-American community on that backside of Beacon Hill. He's not too far from where Sarah Roberts is. Right. That's one of the reasons that he's kind of picked, in addition to a lot of his views. But I would say that he gets along well with him. His father, one of the things his father is very much anti-slavery. Very much, his dad does have that kind of influence on him. But Sumner gets, I would say, his education, his real education, I'd say there's two things. He goes to Washington, D.C. when he's 23 years old for the first time, like a rite of passage trip for a young man, and sees some of the slave auctions and some of the slave pens down there. That has an effect on him, number one. Number two, in 1838, he goes to Europe, another rite of passage, his first trip to Europe, and sees in England, first of all, gets an earful in England about why there's still slavery in the United States. The English abolished slavery 4 years earlier in 1834. They're like reformed smokers, the British. Hey, how come you haven't got rid of slavery yet? But he does hear an earful from them. And then he goes to France and he goes to Italy. And in every country he sees blacks and whites at, lectures, museums, concerts, these kinds of things. And I think it was after his trip to Italy where he sees blacks and whites talking after a lecture. And he writes back, it seems to me that our differences are more about opportunities rather than the nature of things. That's one of his key letters back. And so he gets his education there too. When he comes back in 1840, from Europe. It's a 2-year trip, that first trip. He comes back in 1840. He's a lawyer, and he doesn't like his job. It's dusty, these law books, he can't stand it. Tries to find like something else, gets involved a little bit in prison reform, mental health reform, some education reform. And then after his sister dies in 1844, and Sumner almost dies, the Mexican War is happening. He's furious about the Mexican War. He's furious about Texas, the accession of Texas by the United States. Believes it's a way just to kind of expand slavery. And in 1845, he delivers a huge speech in Boston. Doesn't make it national famous, but really brings down the house, brings the thunder down in Boston in this speech against the Mexican War. And so he becomes this anti-slavery voice in the city in 1845. That kind of launches him, I would say. Then he does the Roberts thing in 49. So it's kind of like the way that timeline goes. Yeah, good. Yeah.
I have another question on behalf of folks online,
Sure.
which is a request to talk a little bit about the relationship between Charles Sumner and Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, I would say the relationship between Douglass and Sumner, it's a great question, is very strong, very good. Douglass is one of Sumner's biggest supporters, biggest champions, and vice versa. I mean, Sumner often, I would say, seeks Douglass's advice as part of his, Sumner, I think, has the voice. Douglass does too. But Douglass is aware that Sumner is in the corridor of power, like he can do something. Douglass is very aware of this during his relationship with Sumner. I'm not going to say uses Sumner, that's not exactly right, but he's savvy enough, Douglass is, to know that we have something here with Sumner. We have somebody who can make the argument within the chamber, which is where it has to be made if things are going to change, right? So that relationship, I think, is good. And then at Sumner's funeral, Douglass is there. Douglass is also at Sumner's bedside when Sumner is dying. And he's at his funeral in Boston, huge funeral, by the way, 50,000 people filed through the State House. Sumner's, body's on display at the State House, 50,000 people filed through, unbelievable number. And Douglass is there for that too. So the relationship is very good, very strong. Yep. Oh, hi, yes, sorry.
How important, so many abolitionists were moved by religious thought, and I'm curious about the place of religion in Sumner's life, and also what he was reading. I mean, Thoreau, for example, was deeply opposed to the Mexican-American War, and was writing, went to prison for it.
Yeah.
And so, I'm wondering about the kind of broader failure of ideas and.
Yeah, so first of all, religious-wise, Sumner's mother was Methodist. Sumner does not really have a formal religion. He doesn't. He believes in God. You see references to the Almighty in some of his letters, but does not have a formal religion. He reads what a lot of those folks read, which is Bible, often. He does read the Bible a lot. Reads some of the English philosophers. He can read in French, so he reads some. He's fluent in French. He speaks some Spanish and some Italian. He's very very good with languages. So he does read those authors. He reads Longfellow's stuff early. He does that often. There's lots of letters where he's like, "This is the best thing you've ever written," that kind of thing. So yeah, I would say he's very well read, and he's very he's an intellectual. Like I would say, he's an intellectual in the truest sense of the word, who plies his trade not in academia but in politics. That's the way I would describe that. Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Two questions. One, based on some of the things that you said, do you think it's possible that today we would say that Sumner was on the autism spectrum in terms of his difficulty with social relationships?
Yeah.
And two, you didn't say much about his most influential period in the Senate, after the Civil War and passing the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act and things like that.
Sure. So the first question was, would we say he was on the spectrum today? So I would, I don't like doing it. I'm not a big fan of the psychoanalysis stuff from 150 years. However, I will say this: there is a note on one page of this book that some historians say he probably had a touch of Asperger's syndrome, what we would call that. So I do mention that one time. I don't get into it a lot. Yeah, you're right. During Reconstruction, it's really kind of interesting. So Sumner, of course, is very much involved in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. He starts off really liking Andrew Johnson, thinks Johnson is going to continue kind of Lincoln's work. Johnson does not do that, as you know. And so he's very much involved in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, but he's not always thrilled with them, usually because they don't do enough. So the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, Sumner wants much more in there in the way of equal rights, again, in that 13th Amendment. And he, again, this is kind of the political side that he sometimes didn't get. Most of his colleagues, even his Republican colleagues, his very strong anti-slavery Republican colleagues, say, because this discussion is happening, it happened in the Senate in 1864, it happened in the South, early in 1865, like just before Lincoln's assassinated and the war ends, that discussion is going on. Now that we all know where the war is going. So a lot of his colleagues during the 13th Amendment discussion say, look, we just got done with 4 years of this horrible war. Like America's exhausted. We are going to pass this 13th Amendment that ends slavery, which is something you have wanted since your 1852 speech. So quit monkeying up the works with all this stuff that's going to sink it, is basically the argument he gets during the 13th Amendment. And Sumner's like, okay, I see what you mean. The 14th Amendment, which of course is kind of a funny amendment, it has equal rights, it has due process, it basically says that blacks are citizens. There's a lot in that 14th Amendment. What does Sumner want in the 14th Amendment? Black suffrage. And everyone's like, listen, there's enough in this amendment as it is. We've got your due process stuff, like you're responsible for that. We got your equal protection under the law stuff, like you're responsible for that. This is 1868 now, right? Let's let that go. Sumner's like, okay, I will. The 15th Amendment, 1870, finally ratified. But during the debates on the 15th Amendment, Sumner, as I said to you earlier, wants more in there in the way of equal rights and gets the same kind of like, it's a little bit of a bridge too far. At that point, Sumner does not vote for the 15th Amendment. There are people who vote for, people who vote against, and a bloc that does not vote. Sumner does not vote as a form of protest. He does, however, work for its ratification. So an amendment has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states after it passes the House and Senate. And so he does work for its ratification. And then, of course, he gets into a little bit of trouble with the Grant administration. So originally, of course, he's a big fan of Grant. Grant then wants to acquire Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic. Wants to acquire Santo Domingo, and Sumner is opposed to that. Feels like the United States should not be kind of doing that, interfering in another, and literally has a falling out with the Grant administration. So much so that in 1872, Grant's re-election, he supports Horace Greeley, Sumner does not support Ulysses S. Grant. And he becomes a pariah in the Republican Party that he basically helped found in 1872. So that's the post. Yeah, it's good stuff, man. It's good stuff. You're going to like it. Yeah. What else? Online? Yeah, okay. Yes, Emily.
Great questions online.
Yes, that's good.
Could you talk a bit about Sumner's friendship with Susan and other queer
Well, I'm sorry, I missed the...
a bit about Sumner's friendship with Susan B. Anthony and other queer figures of the era.
I don't know the second part of the question, other queer figures of the era. I can't answer that. Susan B. Anthony is part of that suffrage movement, was very influential. In 1864, Sumner helps organize, along with the women's suffrage movement, a huge petition drive across all the states to end slavery. He wanted to end slavery. And Susan B. Anthony is a big part of that. Sumner helps with that, kind of, I would say helps direct that. Susan B. Anthony does most of the hard work along with other suffragists. And in 1864, February of 1864, a petition with 100,000 names. Now, this is a petition that has rolled up in basically in cloth. Sumner sets this big, I would say this kind of big extravaganza in the Senate. The petitions are so heavy, the pages can't lift them. And so there's a scene in the book where Sumner asks 2 African-American men to carry the petitions into the chamber, 100,000 signatures calling for the end to slavery. She's very instrumental in that. So as I said, he's kind of close with the suffragists. It's a tough word to say on the plural, isn't it? He's very close with the suffragists, and she is, of course, one of them. And that little bit of a split happens during the 15th Amendment discussions. Yeah. Well, hold on one second. I want to see if someone else who hasn't asked wants to ask before we. Okay.
I was just curious to know, now that you've finished the book and you've talked about it with various audiences and you've received various reviews, is there anything you regret about the way certain choices of emphasis, or things you think you missed that you regret, or things that you included that, I mean, how do you reflect on the process now that you've...
Yeah, did you guys all hear that? So I think, let me start with regrets. I have a few, but then again, too few to mention. No. There's a couple things that came out of the book for, I would say, space reasons. As my editor said, listen, we can't sell this book for $50. So there's some really good stories about Sumner that are out of there. We basically focused on his anti-slavery, equal rights, that part of his life. So, for example, I had a great chapter in there. I had a great chapter in there on the acquisition of Alaska in 1867, Seward's Folly, so-called. Sumner was probably the most influential person in acquiring Alaska. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And at a midnight meeting, Seward said, I'm going to need your help. I've negotiated this deal with the Russians. You got to help put it through. Sumner takes the ball, does all this research in Alaska, reports it out to the Senate, and basically pushes it through. That chapter is out of the book. And so that's one chapter that's out of the book. There's another chapter that's out of the book where very late in the game, late in his life, Sumner is responsible for getting a congressional pension for destitute Mary Todd Lincoln. And so Mary Todd Lincoln, is broke. She has debts. She had been petitioning members of Congress, furious that she didn't get a bigger pension because her husband had been assassinated. She had turned off many members of Congress who just didn't want to take her calls or talk to her. Sumner basically says, listen, we need to do the right thing here. So that came out of the book. But I would say, so those stories on my website, by the way, I have a blog, and I just started the blog series that says, its kind of subhead is things that didn't make it into the Great Abolitionist. So I just did the piece on the widow that's up there now, on Mary Todd Lincoln that's up there now. But I would say, as far as the way the book flows, like the story arc, the pacing, I think it reads great. Like, I love it. I'm sorry, I'm just telling you. And I think my editor was right. I hate saying that, but I think he was right. Let's keep this thing this way. So you look at the index of the Great Abolitionist, the word Alaska doesn't appear, but that's it. That's the honest answer. Yeah. Oh, wait. Okay. Yes.
So given that he was involved with the acquisition of Alaska and past very good friends with Abraham Lincoln, do you have any thoughts on why he's not as much of a household name as... It's
such a great question, why he's not such a household name. So like I was saying, I passed his statue on my way here in the traffic jam of Mass Ave. And it just says Sumner. I've seen the statue 100 times. It just says Sumner. The statue in Public Garden just says Sumner. Both of those statues were erected in the late 19th century when Sumner was a household name. So you're absolutely right. There were biographies written on Sumner in 1905, 1910, I think 1916, and then not much until David Donald's in 1916, 70, and then mine. So I always have a tough time with this question because I don't think there's a clear answer, right? I don't. But I do think this, and I can tell you this just from, Kate and I and my sister-in-law Pat was there for a little bit, just made this southern road trip. And Kate and I have gone south many times, all the Civil War battlefields, I think the abolitionist kind of anti-slavery Civil War history part of Boston is not as prominent as it should be in general. So Boston prides itself on its revolutionary history. It should. It absolutely should. And then there's like this gap all the way to like the Irish arrival and growth and JFK. Like it's that. It's kind of a strange, that abolitionist movement in the middle, let's put it this way. The first state to respond to Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops was Massachusetts. The Massachusetts 6th is the first division to head south to protect Washington, D.C. They suffered the first casualties of the Civil War in Baltimore, which is a border state with a lot of Southern sympathizers, and 4 of their members are killed when they're switching trains in Baltimore. So when they get there, Lincoln says, Rhode Island is nowhere to be found, New York is late, you are the true North here. And so that story, I think, doesn't really get told much. There's snippets that get told, like, the 54th Colored Regiment, right? The movie Glory's made of. There's that beautiful kind of statue memorial across from the State House. That's there. There's the, I think, Black History. Do they call it the Black History Trail? I forget what it is. Yeah. So that's there. But I think part of the reason, just kind of simplifying it, is that the war itself isn't fought up here. The furthest north this war gets is where? The angle at Gettysburg. A high watermark of the Confederacy is at the angle at Gettysburg. So I think that's part of it. There's memorials here, but you go south, there's a battlefield in almost every, more than one battlefield in almost every state, So I just think that's part of it. It's a great question. I've wrestled with it. I don't have a great answer. I feel like that's not a great answer, but
No, thank you.
I'm giving you my best, man. Okay.
I think that is a great question to conclude our formal Q&A with. I want to make sure that folks have time to...
Well, when you say formal, like, are these people coming to my house later for an info? Okay, no. That includes the... Yes. Thank you guys, by the way. Thanks. I'll say one other quick marketing thing. I want to just tell you guys this. If you want to get on my mailing list, some of you are, I already know that. If you want to get on my mailing list, I do about 4 or 5 newsletters a year, e-newsletters, I call them. I don't spam you every day. It's not like Williams-Sonoma where you're going to get something every day. 4 or 5 a year. I'm going to do one in December, just to recap of kind of the things I do, what I'm up to, blah, blah, blah. Feel free to get on that. You're obviously not required to, but just wanted to let you know that's what the sign-up sheet is there. So thanks again very much, guys.
Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just need to find out logistically where she's sitting to take the money. Hey, Emily? Hey, Emily?
Yes, sorry.
Are you?
Absolutely. Yes.
Are you? You're
Selling.
handling the money, right? Yes. Okay. Good. I just wanted to know.
Swimming up